I still don't know why I said yes. It was supposed to be simple, just a couple of tests in exchange for cash I desperately needed. I found the ad on a sketchy forum I barely visited anymore. Healthy adults needed for anonymous scientific study. High compensation guaranteed. Immediate participation. That was it. No logos, no fancy design, just black text on a white background. I wouldn't have even thought about it if my bills weren't piling up. I sent an email out of curiosity, and not 10 minutes later, they replied with instructions. They didn't ask for my ID, just my availability, and told me a car would pick me up the next morning. I should have known then something wasn't right, but at the time, it felt like a miracle. The building was in the middle of nowhere. I remember staring out the window as we drove, watching houses get sparser until there was nothing but trees and cracked asphalt. The car, a black sedan with tinted windows, was dead silent except for the faint hum of the engine. The driver didn't say a word. When we finally pulled up, I saw this massive gray structure with no signs or markings, just a single metal door and a security camera blinking above it. It felt wrong, like walking into a place no one was supposed to find. A man in a white coat met me outside. He didn't smile or introduce himself, just said, "Follow me," and like an idiot I did. The first thing they had me do was sign a stack of papers. I barely skimmed them. It was all legal jargon about confidentiality and liability, but one line caught my attention. You consent to any and all biological modifications resulting from participation in this study. I paused, thinking it sounded bizarre, but the man in the white coat just stared at me like he was waiting for a problem. "It's just standard language," he said flatly. I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I signed. They led me down a series of sterile, brightly lit hallways. Everything smelled faintly of chemicals, like rubbing alcohol. At the end of the hall was a small room. No windows, just a table, a chair, and a weird machine with blinking lights in the corner. For the first few days, the tests were pretty routine. They drew my blood, checked my reflexes, measured my heart rate. But there were other parts that didn't make sense. One day, they had me stare into this glowing panel while they played strange, overlapping sounds through headphones. High-pitched tones mixed with whispers I couldn't quite make out. Another time, they showed me a series of symbols on flashcards and asked me which ones I recognized. I didn't recognize any, but the way they stared at me, scribbling notes furiously, made me feel like I was supposed to. At night, they let me sleep in a small dorm room, but I swear I heard faint noises coming from the walls, like distant footsteps or voices just low enough that I couldn't tell if I was imagining them. By the fourth day, things started to feel off. I woke up with a strange itch on the inside of my wrist, like a mosquito bite that wouldn't stop tingling. When I looked closer, I saw this faint, almost invisible pattern under my skin, like veins forming an unfamiliar shape. I rubbed at it until it turned red, but it didn't go away. At breakfast, I couldn't even eat. The scrambled eggs tasted metallic, like chewing on foil. I thought maybe I was just stressed, but my appetite completely vanished, replaced by this gnawing unease I couldn't shake. The researchers didn't seem to notice, or maybe they didn't care. They just kept ushering me into the same room for more tests. It was on the sixth day that I noticed something I still can't explain. I was brushing my teeth in the tiny dorm bathroom when I glanced at the mirror. At first, everything looked normal, but when I leaned closer, I realized my reflection wasn't moving. I lifted my hand to touch my face, and my reflection stayed still for a fraction of a second too long before mimicking me. It wasn't a lag, not exactly. It felt like it was deciding to follow me. My stomach turned. I blinked hard, splashed water on my face, and stared again. It looked fine after that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me through the glass. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in that building felt louder, sharper, like the walls themselves were alive. By the end of the first week, I started losing time. I'd sit down for one of their sessions, and the next thing I knew, I was back in my room with no memory of what had happened. I found myself staring at the clock, trying to piece together how hours had slipped by. One night, I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. My hands were clenched so tight my nails had left marks on my palms. When I looked around, I noticed something chilling. There were faint smudges on the ceiling like handprints too big and too high up to be mine. I wanted to tell someone, but the staff weren't exactly approachable. Every time I asked about the tests or mentioned feeling strange, they just brushed me off, saying, "It's all within expected parameters." Then came the dreams, or at least I think they were dreams. In one, I was standing in a field under a sky that looked wrong, like it was too close, the stars pulsing like living things. A voice, mine, but not mine, kept whispering something I couldn't understand. When I woke up, I had the distinct feeling that I'd been somewhere else, not just dreaming, but physically absent. I started keeping a journal to track everything, but one morning, I found pages filled with handwriting I didn't recognize. It was my name, over and over in shaky, frantic letters. The more I stared at it, the more I felt like the letters were shifting, like they were trying to form words I couldn't read. On the 10th day, things escalated. I woke up with a strange, heavy sensation in my chest, like something was crawling just beneath my skin. When I looked in the mirror, I saw faint ridges forming along my collarbone, almost like scars, but I hadn't injured myself. They weren't red or swollen, just raised, pale lines that looked deliberate, as if etched there on purpose. I touched them, and the texture was wrong, too smooth, almost synthetic. My throat felt tight, and I started breathing faster, but then I heard it, the voices again. Except this time, they weren't whispers. They were loud, clear, and inside my head. "Do you understand now? Do you see what we've made you?" I stumbled back from the mirror, gripping the sink so hard I thought it would crack. That night, I decided I had to leave. I didn't care about the contract, the money, or what they might do if I bailed. But when I tried the door to my room, it wouldn't open. I banged on it, yelling, but no one came. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped. I tried to call for help, but my phone was gone, probably taken during one of those memory gaps. I started searching the room frantically and found something I hadn't seen before, a tiny camera embedded in the ceiling corner, blinking red. It had been watching me this whole time. The thought made my skin crawl. I sat down on the bed, shaking, trying to figure out my next move. That's when I noticed something even worse. My reflection in the darkened TV screen. It was sitting there, staring back at me, but its head was tilted in a way mine wasn't. I couldn't take my eyes off the reflection. My body was frozen, but my mind was screaming at me to move, to look away, to do anything. The thing in the TV didn't blink. It just kept staring, its head tilted slightly to the side like it was curious about me. Then it smiled. Not a natural smile, but this sharp, wide grin that felt wrong, like it was trying too hard to mimic something human. My stomach churned as I watched it slowly raise a hand. At first, I thought it was waving at me, but then I realized it was pointing to the camera in the corner of the room. I snapped my head toward the camera, heart pounding, but nothing seemed out of place. When I looked back at the screen, the reflection was gone. I barely slept that night, keeping the lights on and pacing the room until my legs ached. By the time morning came, I was ready to demand answers, to confront someone, anyone, about what the hell was happening to me. But when the door finally opened, two men in black uniforms were standing there, not the usual staff. They didn't say a word, just motioned for me to follow. My heart was racing again, but I didn't argue. They led me down a hallway I hadn't seen before, longer and darker than the others. The walls here weren't the sterile white I'd grown used to. They were metallic, almost reflective, but distorted, like funhouse mirrors. I could see my own reflection as I walked, but something about it looked off, like my movements weren't syncing up with the rest of me. At the end of the hallway was a room that felt colder than the rest of the building. The walls were lined with monitors, each one showing a different angle of what I assumed were other rooms in the facility. But what made my stomach drop was that every screen showed me. Some were clips of me walking through the hallways, sitting in my room, or undergoing the tests, but others showed things I couldn't remember doing. There was one of me standing in the corner of my dorm, staring at the wall for hours without moving. Another showed me sitting at the desk, frantically writing something, though my hands were moving too fast, like they were sped up. The worst was a live feed of me, standing in the room I was currently in, only I wasn't moving, just staring directly into the camera with that same tilted head and unnatural smile. I turned to the men, my voice shaking as I asked, "What the hell is this?" But they didn't respond. Instead, they stepped aside, And that's when I noticed the table in the center of the room. On it was a folder labeled Integration Protocol, Subject 072, and underneath it, something that looked like a machine crossed with a medical device. It had straps, blinking lights, and a hollow dome clearly meant for someone's head. "Sit," one of the men finally said. His voice was flat, mechanical, like he'd rehearsed that single word 1,000 times. I tried to step back, but my legs felt heavy, like they weren't entirely under my control. The voices returned, louder now, overlapping and insistent. "This is the final step. Don't resist. You're almost complete." I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but sit in that chair, yet somehow I couldn't stop myself. My body moved like it was on autopilot, legs stepping forward, hands reaching out to touch the cold metal of the machine. My mind was screaming at me to stop, but it was like I'd been disconnected from my own will. The two men stood silently, watching as I lowered myself into the chair. The dome hummed to life the second it was placed over my head, a low, pulsing vibration that made my teeth ache. I felt a sharp prick at the base of my neck, and everything around me blurred, like the room itself was melting away. Then, the voices became deafening. They weren't coming from outside me anymore. They were inside, echoing through every corner of my mind. I couldn't make out all the words, but fragments stuck out. Assimilation barriers collapsing. Host compliant. Images began flashing behind my closed eyes. Places I'd never been. People I didn't know. Symbols I didn't understand. My chest felt like it was being crushed, my lungs fighting for air that wouldn't come. And then, suddenly, everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, I was still in the chair, but the men were gone, and the room looked wrong. The walls weren't solid anymore. They shimmered and shifted, like they were alive. My hands didn't look like mine. They were pale and translucent, with faint veins glowing underneath the skin. I stumbled out of the chair, staring at my hands as they moved like something unfamiliar, something separate from me. The translucent glow wasn't just under my skin anymore. It was spreading, crawling up my arms like living threads. My reflection in one of the distorted monitors caught my attention, and I froze. My face, it was almost mine, but not quite. My eyes were brighter, unnatural, reflecting light like the surface of a pool. My jawline looked sharper, more angular, and my expression, it wasn't mine. The face staring back at me was calm, even serene, while inside, I was falling apart. "This isn't me," I whispered, my voice trembling. Only, the voice that came out was hollow, layered, like two versions of me speaking at once. I turned away, desperate to get out of that place. But the moment I reached the hallway, I realized I wasn't alone. The walls seemed to pulse, shadows shifting along the edges of the flickering lights. Something was moving just beyond my line of sight. I could hear soft, wet footsteps, too deliberate to be random. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking. The sound echoed unnaturally, like the space itself was swallowing it. That's when I saw it, a figure at the far end of the corridor. It was humanoid, but its proportions were wrong, stretched and twisted, like a reflection in warped glass. It didn't walk toward me. It glided, smooth and silent. The closer it got, the more I realized why it felt familiar. Its face was mine, or at least what mine used to be. I turned and ran. I don't even remember deciding to move. My body just acted on instinct. My bare feet pounded against the cold floor, the pulsing walls blurring as I sprinted down hallway after hallway. But no matter how far I ran, every turn looked the same. It was like the building itself was shifting, trapping me in some kind of endless maze. The sound of those footsteps, my footsteps, never stopped. They didn't speed up or slow down, but they were always there, just close enough to make my skin crawl. I felt something else too, a pressure building inside me, like my own mind was pushing against itself, struggling to stay in control. The voices were back, whispering in sync now. "You're ready. You're ready. You're ready." Eventually, I burst through a door and stumbled outside. It was the first fresh air I'd felt in days, but something was wrong. The sky was too still, a flat, empty gray with no sun, no clouds, nothing. The parking lot was empty. except for the black sedan waiting with the engine idling. I didn't think. I just ran to it, yanked open the door, and climbed inside. The driver didn't look at me, didn't speak. As the car pulled away, I looked out the window and saw the building shrinking behind me. For a second, I thought I was free, but then I caught my reflection in the glass. It wasn't me looking back anymore. The figure in the window smiled, a slow, deliberate smile I hadn't made, and I realized with a sickening certainty that whatever I was now, I wasn't the one in control. When the car stopped, I was dropped off in front of my apartment. The driver never said a word, never even looked at me as I stepped out onto the sidewalk. I remember standing there for a long time, staring at my front door, unable to convince myself it was real. Everything felt muted, colors too dull, sounds too distant, like the world around me was just a poor imitation of what I used to know. I eventually went inside and found everything exactly as I had left it, but the silence was unbearable. I tried to speak out loud, to say anything, but my voice was wrong, layered, hollow, like it didn't belong to me. A few days later, I noticed the people. My neighbors, the barista at the coffee shop, even strangers on the street. They wouldn't look me in the eye. Some would turn away the second they saw me, as if they were avoiding something grotesque. Others would just stare, wide-eyed and frozen, like they recognized me, but didn't understand why. The final straw came when I found a letter sitting on my desk. I don't know how it got there. The envelope was blank, but inside was a single sheet of paper with just one sentence. You are part of something greater now. Don't fight it. I tried to scream, to cry, to do something, but when I looked at the darkened screen of my laptop, I saw my reflection again, smiling, tilting its head, watching me. I haven't looked in a mirror since.